So welcome everyone. Thank you again for joining us. This session is Arguments for Basic Income Part 2, and it's going to be featuring two sub-sessions. My name's Jack. I'm here to host this session and any discussions and questions which may follow afterwards. I'm one of the volunteers that's helping with the Basic Income Earth Network World Congress this year, which is being hosted by Glasgow, which is where I'm based as well. I'm also the secretary on the board of trustees at Basic Income Network Scotland, which is the host organisation that's been involved in this. I also recently completed a master's in political communication, in which I investigated how online policy advocacy targets the policy-making process using the basic income movement as a case study. So I'm really interested in the theme of this Congress, which is how we take basic income from idea to reality. We normally have two volunteers, one which is hosting, one which is moderating. Unfortunately, it's just me today, so please bear with me if I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat and look at the questions at the same time, in case there's a bit of delay or anything like that. I'd also just like to go through a bit of housekeeping before we start. Please make sure you are on mute unless you're invited to speak, just so we're not cutting across the speakers or causing any issues for anyone that relies on the subtitles. When you're talking, please speak slowly and clearly if you can, so that the captions can pick up exactly what we're saying. The last portion of the session will be a discussion. Please put your questions in the question and answers box on Hoover throughout the session, so we have lots to come back to at the end. You can upvote questions in there, so please do that as well, so that if there's one popular question which everyone wants answered, we can get to that. I'm hoping that we should have about 30 minutes for discussion at the end, but we do encourage you to use the chat feature throughout in case your question can't be answered. And also, please use the chat function within Hoover as opposed to on Zoom. The chat function will be disabled on Zoom, so please use the chat function on Hoover so that everything's in one place, if that's okay. You can introduce yourself in the chat on Hoover just now if you want to do that to get started. You can also privately message any of the attendees or speakers on Hoover if you want to carry on the conversation after the session is over. And just even more discussion, we also have a roundup session today from 6:30 to 8 p.m. British time, where we can have an even more open discussion with all the attendees that are in the Congress. So please join for that if you can as well. If you have anything specific that you need for this session to be more accessible, then please let us know. You can either tell us just now, or you can message myself privately, and we'll try and be accommodating as we can with that. Just before I hand over to the speakers for the session, I want to remind you that the theme of this Congress is From Idea to Reality, how we take basic income from idea to reality. So keep that in mind when you're asking questions. And in this session, we'll see how our speakers can, relate to that term. We'll be hearing from speakers presenting a specific strong argument that can be made in favor of a basic income. This is split into two sub-sessions, which are around 20 minutes long, I believe, and then hopefully there should be about 30 minutes for discussion at the end, or maybe longer. We'll see. The first talk is from Klaus, who's in the call with us here, and it's on the Speen-Hamlin system, I believe, an early basic income, history, effects, and findings. And we have a pre-recorded video to show. Klaus, do you want to say a bit about that before I put it on, or are you just happy for me to put that straight on?
I can introduce myself. Hello, good afternoon. I'm Klaus Gerhard from Frankfurt, Germany, and I studied economics a few years ago and worked as an economic teacher. I came to the issue of guaranteed minimum income at the end of the 1970s when I was working on my thesis. Wikipedia says about me that I'm one of the pioneers of the German discussion on basic income. That might be true, but that should decide someone else. Now I'm retired, and I'm dealing with some open questions on basic income. One was the Spinhamland system, and I do not agree with Karl Polanyi's meaning that it demoralized the people, and that's the reason why I'm looking for it. This includes that might be enough, so you can take the pre-recording.
Okay, I'll share my screen. Let me know if you can all see it, and we can get this up. 2 seconds, apologies. Can we all see that? Yep, perfect.
My name is Klaus-Uwe Gerhard from Germany, and I would like to present you my paper, the Spinhamland System, an Early Basic Income, Prehistory, Effects and Findings. This paper looks at Spinhamland system, which existed in much of England and Wales between 1795 and 1834, describing the historical context in which Spinhamland was developed, as well as socio-political impact. Further, circumstances and arguments that led to abolition of Spinhamland system will be discussed, drawing parallels to modern labor market reforms. First of all, I would like to mention that as young economics students in the late 1970s, we started to look at Spinhamland system for 3 reasons. First, because we were looking for alternatives to wage labor and were enthusiastic about the idea of a minimum income. Because Karl Polanyi's book made a great impression on us, although we were not convinced by his hypothesis that a family allowance would lead to the transformation to capitalism. And third, because it is still denounced, idolized, and satirized today. This paper is part of the academic review of Spinhamland, which is intended to contribute to make the debate as factual and informed as possible. Introduction. The Spinhamland system, also known as Berkshire Bread Act, was a support payment to farm worker families. Against this, it was argued that this form of poor relief was a well-intended but ineffective form of support. 3 hypotheses are put forward. First, that economically it leads to miscalculations. Second, that politically it points in the wrong direction. Third, that it is an example for bad social policy. My paper reviews the historical background, functionality, and effects of the bread scale and addresses the hypotheses that led to its abolishing. In doing so, the paper uses numerous anthroposophical and historical findings to refute the critique. In a cost-benefit analysis, the advantages of Speenhamland outweigh the disadvantages in hindsight. It is therefore questionable why it was abolished with such determination at the time. This paper summarizes the findings of my book. The origins of wage labor. The analysis goes back to the origins of wage labor to show that wage labor is not an anthroposophic constant and commodification was not a voluntary but a painful, violent process. Pointing this out is important in the light of basic income because it is always said that people cannot live without work. Work has developed into wage labor since Renaissance. Three factors should be mentioned briefly: the privatization of common land, climate change, and the new Protestant work ethic. Rural people lost their economic livelihood based on subsistence farming and moved around. Inequality widened and pauperism increased. What is interesting here is the change in aid to the poor, which was initially private or charitable and then successively nationalized throughout Europe. More and more people became impoverished, moved around, and the cities sealed themselves off from the paupers out of fear or rejection. Workhouses sprang up and spread rapidly, especially in Protestant areas. These processes could be observed throughout Europe, but were particularly profound in England. From this, Polanyi explains why it was in wet and cold Lancashire, of all places, and not in other regions of the world, that the market economy first emerged. Poor relief as cash benefit, wage subsidy. In this chapter, a more detailed circumstances surrounding the emergence of the Speenhamland system will be discussed, which existed almost 40 years and thus went far beyond being a social experiment. Speenhamland was introduced under political pressure, competed as a local poor relief scheme with the introduction of a universal minimum wage, and took place against the backdrop of the French Revolution and numerous wars in which England was embroiled around the world. To calm the situation, the old poor law was supplemented by an income guarantee for agricultural workers' families, which was linked to the wage level, the price of bread, and the number of children. Speenhamland is a Berkshire village, and the name is famous because his system of poor relief. But there are other similar forms of outdoor relief, such as roundsman and labor aid, spread into numerous counties in England and Wales, and formed a right to live. The nature and amount of cash benefits were not uniform over time, but fluctuated greatly with wheat prices, with a peak in 1822-23. The special feature of Speenhamland is that for the first time it guaranteed cash benefits instead of benefits in kind. Effects, side effects, and counter effects. This chapter discusses the thesis that Speenhamland was a reaction of ruling elites to the increasing social unrest in England. And at the end of the 18th and beginning of 19th century, and in this respect can be seen as a kind of hedge against social revolts. Figure 1 in my opinion paper shows the development of life expectancy in the United Kingdom between 1733 and 1850. The Speenhamland system obviously contributed significantly to increase life expectancy. Other data, broken down to individual counties or villages, also show that living conditions improved noticeably during the Speenhamland period. This positive development ended abruptly with the abolition of the old poor law and the introduction of the new one. Another aspect aims at the economic impact mechanism of Speenhamland. Speenhamland system acted as a kind of family allowance and served as a selective wage subsidy for the landed gentry, which ensured that sufficient agricultural labor was available at sowing and harvesting time. As useful side effect was that agricultural laborers were unlikely to be troublemakers. It should be clear that Speenhamland only applied to farm worker families, and other groups at risk of poverty were not eligible. This situation could not please all sections of population, which led to social unrest. The apologists of low-wage sector. This section is about the thesis of the negative effect of an early minimum income. Figure 2 in my opinion paper summarizes Karl Polanyi's economic, political, and social criticism of the Speenhamland system. The rejection of the Speenhamland system lasted for a long time, but more and more historians objected to the negative judgment. An overview can be found in my opinion paper, see Table 1, and of course in my book. It also deals intensively with economic efforts of the wage subsidy. What seems to me worth mentioning here are parallels between the abolition of the Speenhamland system and the arguments used to prevent social reforms nowadays, for example, the Family Assistance Plan in the US, or their intensification as in Germany, which led to the dismantling of workers and Social Rights in 2005. Briefly, Poor People's Policy is education through poverty and low pay. It is about humiliation and meaningless employment. Technical knowledge and vocational qualifications are devalued. Lack of perspective is trained, and the costs of unemployment are by no means lower for taxpayers than an unconditional basic income. My thesis, therefore, is the parallels between contemporary and historical justifications for inequality are striking. They all rely on the belief that low-wage work and the lack of social participation are inevitable. So my conclusions are: this paper attempts to explore various aspects of historical Spinhamland system, identifying similarities and differences with modern welfare and labor market reforms. It should be noted that Spinhamland was not an unconditional basic income, but rather a selective wage subsidy that acted as a family allowance. Spinhamland was one of several variants of income support under the Old Poor Law in England and Wales, because there was no uniform nationwide law for needy population groups, but only local customs for local agricultural laborer families. Other needy groups were not eligible. Nevertheless, Spinhamland of poor relief was preserved by recipients as a right to live. As an outlook, after years of stalemate, the political discussion about an unconditional basic income is rekindling. In times of corona pandemic, where many billions of euros have been distributed in the form of short-time work benefits, it is becoming clear that the question of financing social infrastructure is easier to solve than previously assumed. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Klaus. I believe you also have some diagrams you'd like to share. So if you want to just talk about them while I get them up, and then I'll share them. Just give me 2 seconds.
Jack, we can also ask for questions first, and then there are 8 figures, so that we can go selective to the problem, to the figures. Are there any questions? I can't see it on Wova right now.
Yeah, I can't see anything in the chat. Sorry, I was struggling to unmute myself there. If anyone has any immediate questions for Klaus just now, and if not, I'll share these diagrams and you can talk through them.
Sorry for my English.
Quite all right. We are an international congress after all.
Oh yeah, so you are so kind to me.
I'll get those diagrams up so that you can speak about those a little bit. Give me 2 seconds.
Well, hello. Maybe for the sake of time, if we're asking questions now, I can jump in.
Yeah, go for it.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I'm not sure I got everything. The first question would be, will the paper be available afterwards, or because you seem to have also read it, and I think I would be very interested to read more, basically. And but mainly because so at some point it seems, I'm not sure I got everything straight, but at some point it seemed that I heard you say that there were no national laws regulating the social security system at the time. Well, the word is abusive, but I mean social protection at the time. And I was a bit confused because it seemed that social protection was still regulated by the Elizabethan poor laws, which I assume were sort of national level rules. And the other thing is, more generally, the question was, what do you think of Fred Block and Margaret Summers' analysis of Spin-Hamlin? What do you, because it seems to me, I've read the paper a while back, but I seem to remember that basically what their analysis showed was that actually at the time there were no, well, that the Spin-Hamlin system was very much a fabrication of the 1834 commission that wanted to reform the poor laws, and that basically there was no such thing as a system. There were use of bread scale, but it was nothing generalized, and that basically it all got back to the Elizabethan poor laws thing of the GP having the authority to do many things, the justice of peace having the authority to do many things, and some of them made some sort of income guarantee, but it wasn't any sort of uniform system. So I'm sorry, I've been a bit too long already, but I'm really looking forward to read the paper, and I'd like to know what you think of this.
Your first question was if there is a paper. Yes, I sent it. I sent my opinion paper to the to Timothea. I never saw it then, but it exists. Second, you are right. The first poor law was from Elizabeth, 1601. That was the first in Europe. Before there was a private charity and church, and this was the first one. And your third question, as I understood, yes, Summers, Block and Summers are those who from 2003 who wrote about this, but they were not the first one. And you will see it on my diagram now. I made a table where many of the authors are. You can read. And the rest I did not understand because it was too fast. But let's have a look on the diagrams and then
yeah,
can ask more questions.
I'll share my screen now, and then you can have some time to explain that, and then we'll probably move on to Tom as well, just so we make sure we've got enough time for both speakers, and then if we've got time at the end, we can have questions for everyone. So I'll share my screen just now for those diagrams. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay, I'll move on to the first one.
This is a diagram from 1883 to 1834 and shows counties with Spin-Hamlin system, social expenditures, and others. As you see, there are parallels, but in those counties with Spinhamland system, the people got more money. And you have also the peak in 1822-23. The expenditure per capita, it was the most at this time. So, okay. The second diagram is about wages in agriculture and the consumer prices. You have the line of wages in blue, and it goes up from 1790 to 1805, and then goes up. You will see it on other diagrams also. There is a parallelity between those figures, those data. And after 8020, there is the wages were very low, and also are only on a subsistence level, you can say. The third. This is my best diagram. Life expectancy, as you see, there is a trend line, and it goes from 1730 to 1850, and you see in the first half there is much Schwankungen, and in the Spinhamland period it is always above this trend line. So I think we can say it had a Spinhamland system and other similar forms had an effect of life expectancy in the United Kingdom at this time. Okay. Grain, annual average prices of grain on the wheat is in blue, and there is a peak between there is a peak in the spirium in the first Spinhamland period, I think. The Spinhamland system goes to 1834, it's about here. And here in this period, you see the influence of the Corn Laws very much, especially after 1815. Interesting is 1815 was the year without summer, because there was an eruption of volcano in Indonesia, and there were climate change in there was a climate change in a global climate change for a few years. In Western Europe, it was very cold and wet, and some of you may read the book of Frankenstein from Shelley, who describes it. Okay. Social expenditure and wheat prices again. At this time, the wheat goes up a few years, but in the first period of Spinhamland, wheat prices are decreasing, and then in this period, year on without summer, the wheat prices goes down. Okay, thank you. In my in my opinion paper, you can read this criticism of the Spinhamland system from Polanyi, more detail. It looks like this. Interesting is he described economically, politically, and social effects. And I don't agree with this. You see, demoralized people. And this was the reason why I look for this. I re-examined Spinhamland system